A strongly worded sermon from the Pope this Palm Sunday, condemning the prayers of leaders who wage war.
There can be no mistake the Pope is talking about, in part at least, his homeland.
I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. Today, an American Pope and the international role he plays in wartime. Also, locals in Croatia are a little nervous about an advanced U.S. aircraft carrier in their backyard when it's supposed to be in the Red Sea.
We're a little bit scared because it comes from the area of the war.
Plus, this is a recording from Greenland of a certain sea creature.
You're not going to tell us which one?
Nope, you're going to have to wait to find out.
All right, patience please, people. That's all ahead today here on The World. This is The World. I'm Marco Werman.
And I'm Carolyn Beeler. It's good to be with you.
It took a month, but it finally happened. The Houthis in Yemen have entered the war in the Middle East.
They are backed by Iran and got into the fray on Saturday, claiming 2 missiles launched at Israel. Their involvement further threatens shipping, which could disrupt global markets even more.
A less discussed development over the weekend was the arrival of the world's largest aircraft carrier off the coast of Croatia. The USS Gerald R was pulled from combat operations in the Red Sea. Despite its reputation as the U.S. Navy's most technologically advanced carrier, it's been dealing with some pretty basic problems. The World's Josh Coe is in Croatia, reporting on what's taken this carrier out of action and what it might tell us about future U.S. military operations against Iran.
Well, the USS Gerald R. Ford has been operating as essentially a mobile air base. I mean, that's what an aircraft carrier is. And so previously it was based and deployed to the Red Sea. And it's been key in this region where allies have been reluctant to host U.S. strike operations. I spoke to Nick Childs of the International Institute for Strategic Studies. He told me that it was acting as a deterrent in the Red Sea.
She'd been deployed into the Red Sea in order to be ready to respond to, but perhaps hopefully deter, the Houthis getting involved again. Her absence now may or may not encourage the Houthis to take a hand more than they might otherwise.
Yeah, and so the Houthis that he's talking about right now really has territory right along the coast of the Red Sea there, and crucially at a strait that is really a choke point for a lot of international commercial traffic, ships heading to the Mediterranean to bring oil to Europe. So now they've said that they are joining in fighting the U.S. and Israel alongside their allies, Iran. As Childs was saying, there's a lot of concern about the implications of another front being opened up in the conflict.
Right, and this weekend, the Houthis started sending missiles into Israel. So the USS Ford was in the Red Sea as a deterrent. Why did it end up in this pretty seaside city in Croatia, Split?
Well, it's undergoing repairs, and Split is one of the nearest deepwater ports that can handle a ship of this size. And Croatia is also a NATO ally. It's a good location for shore leave, as you mentioned. And after nearly 9 months deployment, this is kind of a morale boost for the troops as well. It's also important to note, the U.S. has access to local shipyards here. There's contracts with people here who can take care of some of the damage that the ship has been dealing with. And being in Split, being in the Mediterranean here, also keeps the carrier closer to the region than returning to Norfolk, Virginia, where it's traditionally based. Speaking to Brian Clark of the Hudson Institute in Washington, he said that having it positioned in Split might be because of the next potential phase in the war.
And that this may be all an effort to keep it in theater as an option to support. And if there is a ground operation, for example, they're going to want fighter aircraft from the Ford to contribute to close air support and protection of troops on the ground.
As he was saying there, this could potentially be about this next phase.
So, Josh, you mentioned repairs as well. What exactly are these repairs?
The repairs, according to reports, center on a fire in a laundry area earlier this month inside the ship. This happened while the ship was deployed in the Red Sea. It seems that it was quite significant. It took hours to extinguish. Some crew were injured, and more than 200 sailors reportedly had been treated for smoke inhalation. And then another crucial aspect of this is that over 100 bunks were damaged. Each of these bunks could sleep about 2 to 3 sailors. Then there's also the toilet issue aboard.
Yeah, tell us about that, the toilet trouble. What's going on there?
Brian Clark was also telling me about this. So essentially, this ship uses a vacuum sewage system that's not unlike cruise ships. And unfortunately, that also means that it can clog very easily. It requires some very specific cleaning strategies. Since 2023, it's required at least 10 acid cleanings, and each of these costs $400,000 for this $13 billion ship.
Wow.
It needs these regularly. So alongside combat duties, it's dealing with very basic operational problems. And I think it's important to note, because it is the most advanced carrier the U.S. Navy has, that also means that it has new systems that are being tested, including the sewage system.
What's it been like to see this ship there in what is really a tourist city? That's what Split looks like.
Right. I mean, Split is a major tourist destination. It's built around the ruins of Diocletian's palace. Diocletian was this Roman emperor. It's beautiful. I mean, Venetian architecture, palm trees, beautiful weather. And it's this harbor city, so it has these beautiful white-hulled yachts and ferries and cruise ships. And right smack dab in the middle of this bay, you have this huge gray aircraft carrier.
Josh, I'm really curious. What has been local reaction there in Split to seeing the USS Gerald R. Ford in their harbor?
I mean, it's the talk of the town, right? I mean, like I said, it sticks out like a sore thumb in the middle of the bay. You know, everyone's kind of sitting out along the waterfront here, looking out at it. To give you an example of kind of how people are talking about it, this is a headline from Slobodna Dalmatia, the local paper of record. They said, quote, "Split is under siege by the dollar bearers." So the dollar bearers being the sailors. And then they went on to say, Americans arrived eager for everything. On the first evening, boutiques ran out of bread and alcohol. So you get a sense that people welcome this for the local economy. As I said, it's not the tourism season yet. So this is nice for local businesses. But at the same time, you know, as I was talking to locals, some like 30-year-old Teya Yakasa, a nurse in Split, find that the ship is a little unsettling.
We're a little bit scared because it comes from the area of the war.
Great for the local economy in the short term to have the sailors ashore here, but she's also worried about the war's impact on the cost of living. Oil prices here, like everywhere, are going up.
The World's Josh Coe reporting from Split, Croatia. The World reached out to the USS Gerald R. Ford's public affairs officer yesterday. So far, we have not gotten a response.
To a different conflict now. Russia now spends nearly half of its national budget on the war in Ukraine. A lot of that spending has boosted Russia's economy, but after 4 years of fighting, it's created a country of winners and losers. On the winning side, Russia's military-industrial complex, but for the many people outside that sphere, we asked reporter Levi Bridges to dig in on how they survive in an economy transformed by war.
The easternmost edge of Russia is a vast peninsula known as Chukotka that extends out into the frigid seas of the Bering Strait. The indigenous people who live here still hunt whales with harpoons. In YouTube videos, locals drag the whales by boat back to rocky beaches. On shore, people divvy up the meat while gulls and furry dogs snap up the scraps. Alaska is only about 80 miles away, but even here, 10 time zones away from Ukraine, the war is having an impact. Back in 2021, a Russian businessman named Maxim Krupenya set up a hotel here for adventure tourists. At the time, the market seemed promising. It was relatively close to wealthy countries in North America and Asia. But after Russia invaded Ukraine, he says foreign tourists stopped coming.
Business это всегда риск, да? То есть здесь вот все-таки упор на
Business is
частный
always a
капитал.
risk, he says, but you just have to soldier on. He's now looking for investors to help him launch a new business of modular, eco-friendly hotels closer to cities, hoping to tap into a larger domestic market. After more than 4 years of war, Russians all over the country are also pivoting and adapting to a wartime economy. After Russia invaded Ukraine, the West slapped Moscow with heavy sanctions to hurt Russia's financial system.
However, the Russian economy did not collapse. It proved to be more robust and adaptable than the West had anticipated.
Peter Rutland is a professor of government at Wesleyan University who studies Russia. He says Russia is a petrostate enriched by oil revenue. Going into the war, the country had a rainy day fund worth about $180 billion. They partially funded the war with this cash. On the Russian internet, I find videos showing military factories pumping out tanks and weaponry. Rutland says that military spending created lots of jobs.
And so living standards were going up, wages were going up. But in the past year or so, we've seen that eroding, and the government is running out of money.
The rapid economic growth during the war is now slowing, but inflation is still rising. One Russian posted a video on YouTube of a supermarket checkout line to show the rising food prices. The barcode scanner beeps as bored children fool around. One commenter wrote, "Watching the cash register is giving me a panic attack." To stop inflation, the government has raised interest rates. That's made it impossible for many Russians to buy homes. I talked to a young woman south of Moscow who says more people are renting now, which has created a housing shortage. Like others in this story, we're withholding her name because Russians can receive retaliation for talking about the war's effects.
Примерно близко к центру города выросло там примерно в 2-3 раза вот так.
She says rents in her city have doubled or tripled recently. She used to go away on vacations each year, but not anymore. Others have had the safety net fall out completely. A documentary film shows Russians lining up outside a soup kitchen.
Ну, то есть, но в целом это потеря возможности снимать жилье. Это топ-3.
A woman who helps Russia's homeless tells me more people are losing their homes now just because they can't pay rent. Meanwhile, Russian soldiers qualify for specially designated rock-bottom mortgage rates. The Russian independent news outlet iStories interviewed the wife of a Russian soldier inside a gleaming, brand-new apartment.
Для Омска в 23-м году, мне кажется, что это была вполне такая весомая сумма.
She says without support from the military, it would have taken them a long time to get into a new home. But not everyone who supports the war benefits financially from it. I talked to a young woman from a village outside Moscow whose father is a big fan of President Putin, even though he himself is struggling in this economy. She says her father believes state media that blames all of Russia's economic problems on sanctions and the West.
Я пытаюсь сказать, ну, ты же понимаешь, сколько денег уходит на вот это вот ненужное.
She says, I'm like, Dad, just think how much money Russia is spending on this unnecessary war.
И он такой, ну а как? Нужно же было защитить родину.
And then my father tells me we need to protect our motherland, and that I'm the one who's telling him propaganda, she says. The Russian government has tried to amplify their messaging by blocking Western social media apps like Instagram. A marketing professional in Siberia tells me that also affects people's livelihood.
То есть закрыли Instagram. Это очень сильно влияет на продажи, очень сильно.
She says we use Instagram for advertising, so losing social media really affects sales. The Ukraine war is hurting parts of Russia's economy. But there's one war that's become an economic boon. That's the US-Israeli war in Iran. The blockage on oil shipments is driving up fuel prices globally. And this month, the Trump administration lifted sanctions on Russian oil to lower costs. Again, Peter Rutland.
The spike in the oil price has really eased the pressure on the Russian budget, so the economy will probably stagger on.
The U.S. is now reportedly thinking about diverting military equipment worth billions from Ukraine to the Middle East, a move that would offer Russia a strategic and economic advantage on the battlefield. For The World, I'm Levi Bridges.
You're listening to The World. This is The World. I'm Carolyn Beeler. Deep under an iconic bay on the west coast of Greenland, an underwater microphone is recording whale songs, icebergs, cruise ships passing by, and streaming it all online. It's called Disco Live. Scientists launched the live stream as part of a larger research project to learn how climate change is affecting Disco Bay. Oti Tervo is the project's lead scientist. She told us the bay is a biodiversity hotspot.
Below the ice, there are bowhead whales, there are beluga whales, there are narwhals, there are different kinds of seals. So lots of life that we can't see, but we can hear thanks to the hydrophone.
So it sounds like a beautiful place to be working, but I know you're there to learn something specifically. What are you trying to learn by recording underwater there?
Well, it's basically two things. We are very interested in following the changes in the anthropogenic noise sources here in the area. Because of climate change, ice coverage is decreasing very rapidly in this area, and we see a lot more ship traffic. And we are interested to try to follow that, because we know that underwater noise can really be a serious problem for marine mammals.
Right.
That are very dependent on sounds.
So are those cruise ships and shipping and fishing vessels, all those things are increasing?
Yes, all those things are increasing.
Okay. And I think you said there was another reason. There are two reasons?
Yes. So the other reason is that Disco Bay sort of lies at the border of high Arctic and the low Arctic. And during wintertime, we have the Arctic species, so bowhead whales, narwhals, belugas visiting the area. And in the summertime, we have more Atlantic species. And then because the area is getting warmer, we think that there will be a change in the species composition. And because all the species, they make their species-specific sounds, we can use this passive acoustic monitoring to follow which species are present in the bay. Maybe there will be new species, more southern species coming up, and maybe also some of the more Arctic species will be disappearing in time when this area is changing.
So if warmer water species, Atlantic species, start moving farther north as the waters warm, you might be able to record more of their calls and then understand, kind of as a census, who is where and when.
Exactly.
Interesting. Yeah. We have a couple of samples of what you have recorded. I'm going to play them and then ask you to tell us what we are listening to. Let's start with this one. So that sounds almost like a siren to me. What are we listening to? What's making that noise?
That was a bowhead whale singing. And actually, we called this song type as the police siren sound.
Yes, exactly.
How it sounds like. And the bowhead whales, they are super interesting species in that way, because we hear new songs every year in the bay. So that particular example was back from 2005, so over 20 years ago. And then if you go and listen to the live stream right now, you won't be hearing that song, but you will be hearing a different song.
Do you know why?
No, we don't know why. We do think that singing in the baleen whales is something similar than singing in birds. They are probably like a reproduction signal in some ways. Maybe they have a territory that they're defending, or maybe they are competing, but there's still very little we know about the specific meaning of the song and the function of it.
And a bowhead whale, I'm not familiar with that type of whale. Can you describe it for me?
So bowhead whale is quite remarkable in very many ways. It's the mammal species that grow oldest. The oldest individuals have been found to be over 200 years old.
Wow.
Yeah, so they've seen a lot. They don't have a dorsal fin, for example. They can break up to 1 meter thick sea ice. They have the longest baleen plates of all the baleen whales, and they live with the smallest plankton, so they don't even eat fish, but they eat plankton.
Interesting. We have another recording that I'd love for you to describe for us as well. Let's give it a listen. So that to me sounds like a very, very large cow or something. Is it another type of whale?
Yeah, that was a humpback whale, also a singing humpback whale. And humpback whale is one of those more Atlantic species that visit the Disco Bay area and the Arctic in general during summertime. So they come in the summertime to feed in the sort of fish-rich waters here around the Arctic and subarctic. and then they spend the winters in the warmer waters.
Have you already noticed the species distribution changing in Disco Bay because of these changes we've been talking about with Atlantic and then Arctic species?
We can already see that there are more dolphin species, sort of Atlantic dolphin species, that come and visit the Disco Bay area. We can also see that the narwhals and belugas and the bowhead whales, they are ice-affiliated species. So those years when we have less ice, there are less of these Arctic species. So they tend to sort of follow the cold water and the ice.
So I am picturing where you are, and you're talking about sea ice. I'm imagining that Disco Bay is frozen over for much of the year and full of icebergs almost the rest of the time. How on earth do you maintain an underwater microphone in those conditions?
Well, it is difficult. We have lost really, really many hydrophones to the ice and to the sea. So it is difficult. But we have a fantastic spot just outside the town of Kartasuaq called Qaqqaliaq, which is a sort of a protruding, like a little cape in the southern part of the town, and where there are 70-meter high cliffs, and the sea also goes really deep down from there. So there we are able to put out our cabled hydrophone. But we do have some breaks in our streaming every now and then, just because an iceberg has scraped our hydrophone with it or something.
So as you mentioned, you are not just recording these sounds, you are also live streaming them online. I imagine that adds some technical complications. Why was it a priority to make these sounds public?
We just really wanted to share the underwater world. We feel very privileged to be able to work here and visit the Arctic, and also to enjoy this quite remarkable soundscape. And I just felt that it was really important to share that with anybody who was interested.
It's a perfect thing just to have on in the background when you're working or something, not too distracting.
Yeah.
You also work closely with the local community there. Can you tell us about what role these local experts play and what insight they've been able to provide as you go about your work?
So the project is a collaboration with the Qaqqaliq municipality here, and as well as the museum in Kartasuaq, and also Visit Greenland, which is a sort of umbrella organization for tourism. This community, Kartasuaq, traditionally is a hunting community, so hunting and harvesting of marine mammals is very important. This spot was actually pointed by some of the hunters in town where to put the hydrophone. So that was a favorite spot for them to spot the whales. That was super, super helpful. But then there's also an interest to develop tourism and nature-based tourism. So we wanted to sort of join up with the community in order to also enhance sort of options to enjoy the world or enjoy the nature in a different way.
Outi Tervo is a senior scientist at the Greenland Institute of Natural Resources. She leads the acoustic monitoring station Disco Live. More global stories are coming your way. You're listening to The World. This is The World. I'm Carolyn Beeler. As the conflict with Iran crossed the one-month mark, Pope Leo XIV delivered a sharp reprimand to leaders who wage war.
Questo è il nostro Dio, Gesù, Re della pace.
At yesterday's Palm Sunday Mass at the Vatican, the leader of the Catholic Church described Jesus as a king of peace, a God who rejects war, whom no one can use to justify war. Pope Leo went on to say that God, quote, does not listen to the prayers of those who wage war, quoting a line of scripture that tells them, your hands are full of blood. To put those comments into context, we reached out to veteran Vatican correspondent Christopher White. He is the author of Pope Leo XIV, Inside the Conclave and the Dawn of a New Papacy.
For him to specifically condemn leaders who wage wars, it's very clear that this is the issue that keeps him up at night. But it's in continuity with what he's been saying over the last year since his election as Pope.
And is it clear which leaders in conflict the Pope is talking about here? I don't think he said directly in that address.
Popes in general, and this pope in particular, has avoided speaking about specific world leaders. But he's also been very direct about those who are waging war. And, in this particular context, those who are waging war, it's quite clear that it's the U.S. and Israel. And he's called for a ceasefire, which President Trump has rejected, and was specifically asked about the Pope's comments less than 2 weeks ago.
Some U.S. leaders have been using Christian language to talk about the war in Iran. Here's Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth at a prayer service at the Pentagon last week.
May the Lord grant unyielding strength and refuge to our warriors, unbreakable protection to them and our homeland, and total victory over those who seek to harm them.
Hegseth also prayed that God would kill the enemies, quote, who deserve no mercy and who should be, quote, delivered to the eternal damnation prepared for them. Has Pope Leo addressed these sorts of statements by U.S. officials in the past?
In general, Pope Leo has really rejected this sort of rhetoric of war. In an address earlier this year to diplomats accredited to the Vatican, he said, war seems to be back in vogue. And he said, we have to reject this appetite for war. He didn't name specific countries or individuals. But this is a pope from the United States. And when he's speaking with particular clarity about what's happening in his homeland.
Christopher, I want to take a step back and think about history here. What kind of a stance has the Vatican taken historically on wars? And I know that's a big question because the Vatican has been around for a while.
Yes, we're talking about 2,000 years of church history. But I think for this conversation, let's focus on the modern era, and particularly, after the Second World War. The Vatican has been very instrumental and committed to multilateralism and sees itself as sort of a peacemaking institution. Pope Paul VI came to the United States to speak to the UN in 1965, where he uttered the phrase, "Never again war." And that phrase has been repeated by every pope since then, never again war. And in fact, in Pope Leo's first Sunday address after his election last May, he repeated those words of Pope Paul VI and made them his own. And I think he sees himself in the line of a tradition of several popes who have seen their responsibility on the world stage to be that of peacemakers.
What about the more recent past? What have popes said or actually done concerning, for example, the war in Iraq or the war in Afghanistan?
On the eve of the war in Iraq, Pope John Paul II was deeply concerned, warning against it. He sent his own emissaries, one to Iraq and one to the United States, urging them not to go into this war. He warned that it could have catastrophic impacts and could leave the country in shambles for decades to come. And I think most observers would say what he warned about in the early 2000s has come to pass.
Are there other examples you can think of when the Vatican actually, went directly to world leaders or tried to intervene in some other more direct way than, speaking from the pulpit?
Yeah, certainly Pope John XXIII, who wrote his most famous document, Pacem in Terris, Peace on Earth, was written at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis. That document was sent sort of back-channeled to the White House, particularly trying to influence the Kennedy administration. And the Vatican was later thanked for its efforts there. So the Vatican, has a global network of diplomats around the world who work very discreetly, particularly on matters of justice and peace. When it's quite sensitive, most of their work is done behind the scenes, out of the public spotlight, and then we find out about it years later.
Is there any evidence that these interventions have had any effect on the ground at stopping or shortening conflict?
In recent memory, I would point to in 2014, Pope Francis made a direct appeal to avoid the conflict in Syria. And we, of course, saw the Obama administration step away from the sort of the famous red line. That was largely attributed by many people to the influence of Pope Francis's direct appeal in that moment.
So the U.S. did not enter that war, but of course, Syria did undergo a bloody civil war for many years still. Yeah. I understand that there is something called the just war theory in Catholic teaching. Can you tell me what that is and how that relates to this conversation?
Just war theory is something in Catholic teaching that has developed over centuries, where the Church has tried to help define and redefine the parameters in which countries can engage in conflict. And if it enters war as a last resort, what sort of conduct can be justified in war. And across the board, religious leaders have largely condemned this current war in Iran as an unjust war, saying it fails to meet the criteria of just war.
I'm curious if you have any insight into how other nations might interpret or respond to Pope Leo's remarks over the weekend.
I think many world leaders are grateful for Pope Leo using his megaphone that he has. I mean, the Vatican does not have any economic power. It does not have an army, but it does have the ability to speak to 1.4 billion Catholics around the world and many others who listen to what the Pope has to say. And so they see the Pope's voice as one of moral persuasion in a moment that is deeply fraught, where the world seems very much on edge.
I'm curious what you'll be watching for in the weeks and months ahead to understand if Pope Leo does have any impact on the conflict in Iran.
The Catholic Church is heading into its busiest week of the year, Holy Week. And of course, the Pope is in the public spotlight. So I can imagine over the course of this week, we will hear Pope Leo continuing to make appeals for peace. It will be very interesting to hear if the Secretary of State, who is a Catholic, Marco Rubio, the Vice President, who's a Catholic, if there's any engagement directly with Vatican officials as the U.S. tries to find an off-ramp from this war, if they try to seek counsel from the Vatican in any capacity.
Veteran Vatican correspondent Christopher White is the author of Pope Leo XIV, Inside the Conclave and the Dawn of a New Papacy.
And now let's catch you up on a few things you might have missed. The CEO of Air Canada, Michael Rousseau, has announced he's retiring at the end of this year. He came under heavy criticism for his response to last week's crash at LaGuardia Airport between an Air Canada plane and a fire truck. After the collision, which killed 2 pilots, Rousseau issued a message of condolence, but only in English. Air Canada is based in the French-speaking province of Quebec, and one of the 2 pilots killed in the accident was himself a French-speaking Quebecer. Prime Minister Mark Carney was among many to say that the English-only message showed a lack of compassion and judgment.
Another development in air travel, China just resumed direct flights to the North Korean capital of Pyongyang. Chinese tourists used to make up about 90% of all visitors to North Korea, but at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, the country closed its borders to foreign tourists and did not begin reopening until 2024. That reopening has been slow. China is North Korea's ally and biggest trading partner, but like so many relationships, it is complicated. According to Chinese state media, the first Air China flight to land was welcomed in Pyongyang by the Chinese ambassador and other diplomats.
Finally, news from the art world about a museum heist. Thieves broke into a museum on the outskirts of Parma, Italy last weekend. They took 3 paintings, a Renoir, a Cézanne, and a third one by Matisse. Authorities say it took the thieves all of 3 minutes to make off with the works.
Those are a few headlines you might have missed.
It has been 5 months since Hurricane Melissa ripped through Jamaica. The Category 5 storm was the strongest to ever make landfall on the island. 45 people died in the immediate storm. Roughly 150,000 homes were destroyed. Since then, people on the island have been working steadily to recover. Ian Stein is the Jamaica representative for the World Health Organization's Pan American Group. Speaking to us from Kingston, he told us that the big picture of life in Jamaica today is uneven.
It's actually a tale of 2 cities, one might say. In this case, it's a tale of 2 parts of the island. In the eastern part of the island, where Kingston is the capital city, the main economic city of the country, it's largely business as usual as it would have been before the hurricane. However, when you venture west, where the path of Melissa was, then you see a completely other picture. While the physical landscape, the trees have, make their miraculous rebirth and the trees come back, that type of thing, the greenness of the island comes back. Around the infrastructure is where you see things are really challenged. You see a lot of homes, especially a lot of infrastructure, schools, etc. These are all still struggling to recover from the enormous impact that Melissa brought.
So that's what it looks like on the western side of the island. What does it mean in terms of day-to-day life for people?
Well, let's imagine you and I in our normal routine. If my house was affected, well, the question is, do I have access to doing the repairs on my own home? If I have children and sending them to school, the schools are still affected. There's no doubt about that. And then if, unfortunately, something should go wrong and I need to consult a primary healthcare center, something that's near my home, The services are there. However, the infrastructure is badly damaged in many places. There are recovered centers, but because of the scale of Melissa, the health system has really been compromised.
So your specialty, Ian, is the healthcare system. What kind of impact did the storm have on the health sector in Jamaica, and how has that specific recovery gone so far?
So there are about 325 healthcare infrastructures in the whole island of Jamaica. That includes primary healthcare centers. Then on top of that, you have several community hospitals, and then you have some higher level tertiary and hospital system as well in the country. Of the 325 institutions, the Ministry of Health and Wellness had shared that in excess of 100 of those infrastructures that were severely affected. So you had a large swath of primary healthcare centers and then 5 hospitals that I had mentioned. And so I think that we have to recognize the first thing is to try to get things back as best as possible, the emergency things, to make sure that people have access to health services. And then you also have to plan how to deal with these issues in the longer term, because when you repair roofs in an emergency, the immediate repair is not always going to be the permanent repair. One of the lessons that was revealed from Melissa was that in those health centers where we had done renovations over the past years, for those health centers that were really on the path of the worst part of the storm, they fared very well. And within the immediate days, they were back up providing services to their communities and to people around.
And why is that? What did they have that made them able to get back up and running so fast?
So this program does assessments of the infrastructure and makes them climate resilient to make sure that the roofs stay on the health center, that the water systems are there immediately after a storm, that we have electricity and backup systems ready to go. And so these types of things prove to be exceptionally useful. And what we see in the future is that the Ministry of Health and Wellness and the government of Jamaica has adopted this approach because they see the future, that we know that unfortunately storms like Melissa are not going to be exceptional. They're going to be increasing over time.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, for the clinics in Jamaica that got severely compromised by Melissa, what is the range of repairs we're talking about?
Well, it's from A to Z in this respect. In some respects, it's minor, depending on how close a center was to the path of the hurricane. And then in other cases, you're starting over from zero. There's 3 hospitals in particular that were not well placed to be able to deal with a storm. They were too close to the coast. And so the government, working with us and other partners, are looking to consider actually moving those to different locations, a more suitable location where they can be more resilient to this kind of wind and flooding.
So your organization, PAHO, works with the Jamaican government doing a lot of disease surveillance. Are mosquito-borne diseases growing as a result of the storm 5 months ago?
We don't see that at this time. I have to say it was a bit of a surprise because the flooding was extensive. And when you have extensive flooding, and sometimes your system to control mosquito populations is not at its best right after a storm, you would see a lot of mosquitoes in the normal cycle that mosquitoes have within about 2 weeks after some extensive flooding. And I think that we were all very relieved to see that we didn't see a spike in the numbers as it relates to mosquito-borne disease, which is an excellent situation to be in.
Just briefly, in terms of health system recovery from Melissa, what are the long-term projections? Are you optimistic?
When you see something like Melissa, and this is a conversation I've had with many people over the past months, one of the important things to keep in mind is the scale of the impact of Melissa. In any country around the world, if you saw 5 hospitals running into infrastructural problems, it would be very difficult to overcome quickly. But we know that the support from the international community, but also the resilience of the government of Jamaica and the people of Jamaica in particular, we see where this is going, and time will heal this wound. It's just going to take a lot of time.
Ian Stein is the Jamaica representative for the World Health Organization's Pan-American Group. We reached him today in Kingston, the capital.
It is a mystery that continues to baffle. 78 years ago this month, when Czechoslovakia was still a country, the body of its foreign minister, Jan Masaryk, was found beneath his bathroom window. This was just 2 weeks after the communists had seized control of the country. Questions have long swirled about whether the KGB or its counterpart in Czechoslovakia were involved. As Inside Europe's Rob Cameron reports, police are now examining fresh evidence.
After the war, Jan Masaryk, he didn't have
A tour of Jan Masaryk's apartment in Černín Palace, headquarters of the Czech Foreign Ministry. The bathroom in particular has been preserved almost exactly as Masaryk left it 78 years ago.
As representative spaces. For example, the library.
On the early morning of March the 10th, 1948, Masaryk's pyjama-clad body was discovered by maintenance workers in the courtyard beneath his bathroom window, a short distance from the wall. And that is one of the few things we know for certain. Everything else is subject to interpretation.
So it happened somewhere here between this bedroom.
My guide to the apartment is Ivan Dubovitsky, a diplomat who serves as the head of the ministry's Unit for International Cooperation. Ivan is now the custodian of these rooms. He is, in a sense, the guardian of Jan Masaryk's ghost.
My people, as you know, were ready to die for an ideal.
Murder, suicide, or accidental death. Almost 80 years on, it's a case that still grips Czech society, a society that elevates the figure of Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk, the founding father and first president of Czechoslovakia, and his son Jan, almost to the status of secular saints. Ivan Dubovitsky again.
For many people still today, especially generation of my parents, grandparents, Masaryk, the name Masaryk, was the symbol of humanity, democracy, moral, very high moral standard. And Jan Masaryk was in a way his successor. And after the Second World War, he was probably even more popular than President Beneš, thanks to his BBC broadcastings from London, from exile, thanks to his lectures and speeches in United States, in London, and so on and so on.
You will be seeing things happening in my little country, diametrically opposite to everything my father stood for, and I humbly but proudly stand for today. And I beg of you.
He was one of the last symbols of democracy in Czechoslovakia. We know that the democracy was undermined even before, but with his death, the last symbol disappeared and the democracy finally disappeared.
Detectives from the UDV, a special police unit set up after 1989 to examine the crimes of communism, are now sifting through the Masaryk files once again. Those files, police protocols, witness testimony, autopsy reports, analysis by biomechanics experts, video and audio interviews have been bolstered by 150 pages of newly discovered documents from British, French and American diplomatic archives. They will present their findings to the state prosecutor in 6 months. Researcher Václava Jandečková has pushed police to examine the new foreign material and also claims a previously ignored fact about Masaryk's body has been overlooked.
I když jsem tomu dříve nevěřila,
I didn't believe it before, but now I'm convinced that Jan Masaryk sustained head injuries not only on his temple but also behind his ear, whether it was from a pistol or a cattle gun. I gave to police an excerpt from a 1968 report from Czechoslovak television featuring testimony from a woman who was one of only 2 people who touched Masaryk's body. She says she felt a strange hole behind his ear with dried blood around it. And if we have this direct evidence, I don't understand why the state prosecutor still hasn't agreed to open the grave and examine the bone remains. Because today, with the modern technology we have, the remains wouldn't even need to be moved. They would be examined on site, so I don't understand why the police don't do it.
But even if an exhumation proves Masaryk was stunned as part of an operation to defenestrate him, the question is, by whom? Václava says the finger points towards Moscow rather than homegrown Czechoslovak communist agents. But there's a problem with both theories. The nascent communist government needed Masaryk to stay in the cabinet as the only democratic minister. He was a fig leaf. And as for the KGB theory, where's the proof? Beyond one drunk KGB officer claiming at a party he'd thrown Masaryk out of the window. Veteran researcher Jaroslav Čvančara has a completely different theory.
I differentiate between two Jan Masaryks. There was the Jan Masaryk we know and love, witty, an orator, educated, a man who did so much for the rebirth of Czechoslovakia during the war. He could speak not only to our troops, but to the British in their own language. But then something happened. During the war, the Soviet Union began emerging as a superpower, and Masaryk began defending President Beneš's increasingly pro-Soviet line. After the war, he initially tried to play both sides, but he soon understood how the Soviet Union was growing in strength, how even the Americans were yielding to Stalin. So from 1947 or so, Masaryk began pursuing an even more pro-Soviet policy than Beneš. When you read his articles from that time, he's even more Soviet than the Soviets.
Tak on je sovětštější než Sověti.
Today in the capital, Communist Premier
Yaroslav believes Masaryk's overtures to Stalin and refusal to resign, something that would have forced President Beneš to call new elections, proved fateful. He says it was a trio of ultra-patriotic Czechoslovak military and intelligence figures, virulent anti-communists, war heroes who fought with Masaryk to preserve the Czechoslovak state, who visited him that evening. One of them later confessed, Yaroslav says spontaneously, to the crime. But again, beyond the confession, there's no proof. If Masaryk was thrown out of the window, why did he land on his heels, facing the building? If he had decided to take his own life, why was he making arrangements to join his fiancée in London the following week? If he did have visitors that night, why were they never identified by witnesses? Perhaps, maybe, we should accept we'll probably never know the answer. This is Rob Cameron in Prague.
Czechoslovakia. Only two outstanding Democrats remain in freedom, Beneš and Masaryk.
That report from DW's Inside Europe podcast.
The World is produced by GBH and PRX, broadcasting weekdays from the Nan and Bill Harris Studio in Boston and from the Department of Communication at UC San Diego. I'm Marco Werman.
And I'm Carolyn Beeler. Join us back here tomorrow.
The World is supported by the Carnegie Corporation of New York, working to reduce political polarization through philanthropic support for education, democracy, and peace. More information at carnegie.org. By the Lumina Foundation, committed to a fair, universal system for learning beyond high school that offers every American the chance for a better life. LuminaFoundation.org. By the PRX Ambassador Council, whose members include Judy Piggott, the Gruber Family Foundation, the Schmidt Family Foundation, and Gavin Salmonese, LLC. The World's theme music is composed by Ned Porter. The World is a co-production of GBH Boston and PRX.
PRX.